voice of women in sport.
This episode of Fair Play contains frank discussion about rape and sexual violence that some people may find distressing. I'm Zoe George and welcome to the February episode of Fair Play, a podcast covering women in sport from athletes and results to current affairs and issues. This podcast is made in association with RNZ and wispsports.com. If you're into podcasts as much as we are, check out RNZ for politics, crime and lifestyle podcasts and wispsports.com for everything to do with women in sport. This month we tackle a really tough topic dominating the media: sexual violence and sport. We discuss the socio-cultural settings that lead to sexual violence in sport, what is being done to educate those both in and outside of sport about this issue, and come up with a proactive process to help organisations put steps in place. We talk with Women in Sports Aotearoa Sarah Leberman, New Zealand Rugby's Eleanor Butterworth, and Member of Parliament and former international rugby player Louisa Wall. We also take a look at the Halbergs, and of course, it's not fair play without an update about the toilets at the Basin Reserve. Today's co-host is sexual violence prevention campaigner and sex educator Judy O'Brien. Kia ora, Judy, it's so lovely to have you back on the show.
Kia ora, Zoe, it's great to be here.
And this is actually a perfect discussion to have you in, because today you've been up at Victoria University, haven't you, talking about preventing sexual violence on campus.
That's right. So I met with the VUSA, Victoria University Students Association exec, and some of the staff for VUSA and a few of the other staff from the university to talk about what we can do as a community to keep each other safe and promote positive, healthy, sex-positive relationships.
Sounds good to me. We'll definitely talk more about that and a bit of consent as well later on in the show. But let's start our discussions. Once again, this contains frank discussions about rape and sexual violence that some people may find distressing. Discussions around sexual violence in sport have been dominating the media landscape over the past few months. This follows a selection of a sportsman for a national team who was found not guilty of rape. Over the summer, people have appeared at games with signs saying no means no. Articles have been written about boycotting the sport, and questions have been asked of organisations regarding their stance on the issue. But instead of addressing inactivity, let's look at why sexual assault in sport happens and what can be done to change it. Research out of the United States by the Centre for Gender Equity and Health at the University of California suggests sports culture can end sexual violence in a generation. The research shows 1 in 5 women have been victims of rape. Now, just to put that into context, there are 5 women on the show. It suggests that sport culture can promote or perpetuate beliefs related to male entitlement, value and dominance, and lack of empathy, factors which support rape culture. But sport involvement is also associated with pro-social values and skills, including accountability, social cohesion, and self-control. Sport can be both an avenue and a platform for change. So how do we encourage sport to help influence change regarding sexual violence? To understand how we can change, first we have to understand the current climate. Professor Sarah Leberman has been on Fair Play a few times now over the years. She's been leading the charge regarding academia around women and girls in sport and co-founded WISPR, Women in Sport Aotearoa, in 2017. Last year, she was recognised as Next Magazine's Women of the Year in Sport. Well done, Sarah. Thank you for joining us. What is the socio-cultural context around sport and why is sex part of that?
It's a big question, but in short, I would say that it's about sport being a reflection of society and what happens in the wider context. And as you've just alluded, the research out of the States says that 1 in 5 women have been the victim of sexual assault or rape. In New Zealand, the figures are, I think, 1 in 3 have experienced domestic violence of some type. So it's part of our society, unfortunately, and the rise of the Me Too movement has certainly brought to the fore what needs to be done in this space. And we are seeing change. I do think we are at a cusp where society at all levels is moving to addressing the issues that exist. The concern that I guess I see is that we have ongoing challenges about how we keep both girls and boys and men and women safe in an activity which, yes, we purport to be a good pro-social activity, i.e. sport and physical activity, and we're not immune in this space. So long answer to your question. It's part of society everywhere around us. It's in the media, it's the images that we get, it's the predominance of men, often in leadership positions, and the male hegemonic culture that we are within. But things are changing, so I guess I'm trying to put a bit of a positive spin on this, and I would say that within the New Zealand context, with the new government that we've had and with the new strategy around girls and women in sport and active recreation, we're trying to make positive steps toward changing things in this space.
Sport traditionally is a space of masculinity, isn't it? Sport was
Yes.
created by men, for men's interests. And so when you get women in there, that kind of changes the balance, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It does change it, and unfortunately, we've still got quite a long way to go. And the white heterosexual male is the norm, and anybody that deviates from that in any ways is compared against it. And there is still work to do, but we are seeing changes. And so I guess I'm forever hopeful that together, both women and men, we can change the environment for us to be able to move forward and to be able to create wider societal change through what we can do in sport. And again, I would come back to the fact that New Zealand, we are a small country. And if we can't do this, and if we can't work together to try and make these changes, then larger countries are going to be much more challenged. So if we can lead the way, then I think that's an exciting space to be.
Women in Sport Aotearoa is celebrating its 2-year anniversary on International Women's Day. What's Whisper's stance on this at the moment?
So Women in Sport Aotearoa does not condone any type of sexual violence in sport and active recreation, irrespective of gender. Sport and active recreation should be a safe space for everybody to be in and to be able to participate and enjoy to the level that they wish to be involved in.
Sarah Leberman's our guest to start with in our discussion around particularly rape culture in sport. Judy, there's something about rape culture, but it's not just, it doesn't have to be physical, it can be vocal as well, and perpetuating that culture through language.
Absolutely. I mean, when we're looking at rape culture, and I try not to use terms like rape culture when I'm speaking to a new group of people because that can really alienate people straight away. So I try to use really accessible language and talk about the messages that we receive from society and how issues of gender are constructed and the healthy messages we receive and the less healthy messages we receive. So when we're talking about sexual violence, we're talking about any unwelcome activity that can be verbal, visual or physical that is unwelcome and sexual in nature. Athletes and coaches are community leaders and they can have an enormous influence on the way we talk about a whole range of issues. So I'm really interested in looking at how men and women and people of anywhere on the gender spectrum can influence those paradigms related to unhealthy masculinity that we sometimes see coming out in sport and how we can promote what we're really looking for and those healthy qualities we want in our leaders. How do we tease that out and how do we do that as a community?
Well, some organisations have already started to put particular things in place, including New Zealand Rugby, who've set up a respect and responsibility panel. Sarah, is this something that all sporting organisations should be doing?
We firmly believe that we need to be doing something in this space. And so as part of Women in Sport Aotearoa's strategic initiatives, we are looking at safe sport, and that also links into the International Working Group on Women in Sport, so the Secretariat and the International Conference that we will be hosting in Aotearoa in 2022. Safe sport's an important part of that. And part of this is to try and make organisations aware of, one, what it means, and so I really liked what was just shared around the different natures and types of harassment and abuse that exist. And for me, and the research would show, is that there's a spectrum. And so we have at one end rape, the physical abuse and physical rape, but it starts way earlier. There's psychological abuse, there's some physical abuse, there's neglect, there's a whole range, and actually we need to be really mindful of all of those and provide an environment where none of those take place. And in New Zealand, we actually have some resources. Internationally, there's some excellent resources out there, and I believe that we should be making these available to organisations to access. So New Zealand has a safe sport for children. They have a really useful, accessible guide, and it's about making sure that, and it's put out by Sport New Zealand, about what organisations can do, and there's a checklist and some policies and practices. One of the best ones I've seen is actually the parent toolkit that comes from the US Centre for Safe Sport. So I think if we look at the resources that are out there and we start those conversations and we highlight what organisations can do, then we can make some systemic change, because that's the important thing. It's about changing the system and making sure that we have a safe environment. And one example would be, so in New Zealand we know that at primary school and even into intermediate and secondary school, if kids want to play sport often or be part of a team, if they're not in the top teams, it's like, okay, well, who's going to put their hand up to coach the kids? Who's going to look after them? Who's going to take them? So some parent generally says, oh, yeah, I'll do it. And I'm not sure how consistent we are at actually providing the vetting of these people, providing them with training as to what they need to do and what's important in terms of good coaching and the relationships you have. If you're a parent and you coach, there's some challenges there about the dual role, particularly if your own kids are in that team. And just those kinds of things that we can do that start off providing a really good base and a really good experience for children within this area.
Professor Sarah Leberman there. This is right. There are lots of resources already out there, isn't there, Judy?
Yeah, there's a whole centre for resources on prevention of sexual violence that is housed in the States, and there are sporting organisations who have been doing their own little pieces of work, and it's all starting to come together, and we can get a much bigger idea of what these community leaders can do and what we can do practically and the steps that we can take. And we're already seeing that happening in New Zealand. We just need to be sharing all of that information.
Well, New Zealand Rugby are making massive strides in this area. And our next guest is Eleanor Butterworth from Te Hurihanga Create the Change, which is come out of the Respects and Responsibility panel that was set up by New Zealand Rugby. That happened in 2016, and it was established to tackle inequalities within the sport, including pushing for gender equality. Now, she's formerly the agency manager of Wellington Rape Crisis and was previously the education and program coordinator for Wellington Women's Refuge. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
First, before we get into the sports issues, how do we talk about this issue of sexual violence without re-victimising the survivors?
I mean, I think that's always a really tricky balance. I think probably my best answer, and it's very unspecific, is thoughtfully. So being careful not to use victim-blaming language, not making general sweeping statements about how sexual violence affects people or who does it, what people should, inverted commas, do if they've been affected by sexual violence. I think all of those sorts of things in terms of how we talk about it are really important, to be cautious with our language and remembering that survivors, there's as many different ways that people feel about sexual violence as there are survivors. So
we talked about women and statistics related to women, but men are also victims of sexual violence, and those in the LGBTQI community as well. Those numbers are quite high, aren't they, Judy?
Yeah, they get higher and higher as well. And when you start to look at minority communities and the minority stress of those communities, it's not surprising to think, okay, this experience it's not great, and it happens way too often.
And the horrible word, it's universal. It happens to so many different people of all walks of life, both in and outside of sport. Within sport, though, Eleanor, you've been employed by New Zealand Rugby for Te Hurihanga Create the Change. Tell me about your role with this and how have things changed since you've come on board?
So it's an ACC-funded program that looks to bring harm prevention and healthy relationships education to sporting communities. So that is communities, professional players, staff, coaches, everybody. And I think that more and more what we know is you can't just have specialists talking about these things. We've also got to help our communities to have these conversations and be conduits to the specialists who can do that longer term work as well. Yeah, we're seeing more and more initiatives coming up at community level, and that was sort of the gist of it. And so it covers family violence, consent education, healthy relationships, bystander skills, And once I was in there, I started taking on the child protection work as well, and you were talking about resources, and we've done a huge amount of work in resource creation based on a lot of the material that you were referencing from both overseas and from Sport New Zealand. And basically, if we look at all the evidence of what creates change, it's got to be both environmental change, it's got to be culture change, it's got to be individual skill building, it's got to be in the relationships that we have, it's got to be in the structures that we set up. So it was really timely that it coincided with the big culture change program, which we're running, because it really needs all of those components to be successful. So I run things both, I'll do workshops for professional players, but also for staff groups. I will do support for our coaches in terms of how can they reinforce really positive messages. I will write resources, been involved in a lot of the implementation around child protection. That is, how do you actually bring policies to life? How does that policy held at national level or at union level actually get to where the children are? So it's a really varied and interesting role. And I sort of think about it as needing to create change like this. You kind of need a million drops in the bucket. So you need a million touch points. It's not that you need 1 3-hour workshop or that you need one policy. You need really consistent touch points across all the kind of influences and individuals in an environment.
Yeah, multiple interventions. Yeah. And those million droplets can be a million people as well.
With our cultural change, we have been seeing a little bit of the top down, but actually it needs to come from the grassroots up as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The role of leadership in making change sustainable is really well documented, but you've also got to be making sure that it reaches the grass level and that the grassroots are saying this is what would work in our environment, this is what our community needs, this is actually the strengths in our communities to have this conversation and make these changes. So it's absolutely needing to do a mix of both.
And they're not easy conversations to have. So how do we go about having those conversations in particularly a sporting environment without causing tension or problems?
How do we make that conversation accessible?
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the ways I do this, and I encourage unions to do this as well, is to think about it in terms of protective and risk factors. So what are the things that drive up the risk of harm occurring, and what are the protective factors that drive down those risks? And getting people to kind of consider all those things in their own environment. And that can be quite a gentle way of talking about it. I also think having people in the environment who have really high levels of comfort with these topics. Comfort's maybe not the right word, but I'm really used to having these conversations, and that can also help people feel a little bit safer having them. And I think that's been really useful with the work we've done in communities where they've formed really good partnerships with their local agencies, their local knowledge bases. But I also think it's about doing it regularly. Like with the child protection work I do, I often say to compare it to how we teach kids to cross the road. So when we teach kids to cross the road, we start when they're very young and we point out the green man or the green woman, and we show them what zebra crossings are, and then teachers talk to them about it, and we hold their hands the first time, and we just really reinforce that message again and again and again in lots of really gentle, small ways, and lots of relationships through that as well. But for some reason, when it comes to things like sexual harm, we will have sort of one awkward conversation once and then hope we never need to think about it again. So it's also getting more comfortable having that conversation regularly. And I did a workshop before Christmas with a staff group from a union, and I said, I asked people to put themselves on a continuum from how comfortable they are talking about family and sexual violence to how uncomfortable. And one of the people that was at the I'm really comfortable end, I asked him, what made you comfortable? And he said, I've actually done about 6 workshops with you over time. And the first time we did it, I was like, I don't want to go there. But he said, gradually it's just become normal to talk about these things and to think about how we, bring those in. And that's not all workshops, that's lines and newsletters, that's a club captain's speech that talks about respect, that it's not even always talking about sexual violence. That's an important strand, but it's also about talking about gender equality. It's about talking about respect. It's talking about our choices and the way that we treat people and all of those sorts of things. So it's embedded in lots of there's a million opportunities where we're having parallel conversations that we could hook some of those other topics into.
Eleanor Butterworth from Te Huruhunga Create the Change, New Zealand Rugby's respect and responsibility programs that are going into the grassroots. I understand, Eleanor, that you've actually been doing a lot of work in places like South Canterbury, and they've really taken to having these conversations very openly.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I've found with this work. Now being sort of bedded within a community organisation or an organisation that has tentacles into all these communities, is that actually in every organisation, in every rugby club, in every union, there is people who have wanted to have these conversations because people are really deeply invested in the people in their communities and people care about them, and we don't not have these conversations because we don't care. We don't have them because we're worried about opening a can of worms. We're worried about getting in over our heads, all of those sorts of things. So my experience has been everywhere I've gone, there's been someone who's been like, yes, I want to have this conversation. So, and what our research shows is, you create critical mass. If one or two people will start that conversation, other people will jump on board.
What are some simple proactive ways that we, the sporting community, can talk about this issue?
Oh, I think there's lots. I think you can talk about it by, say, if you hung posters in your clubs and then your club captain or someone stands up and says, hey, you might have noticed these, let me tell you why I believe in this. And you can do it by making sure that we help, I don't really like the word call each other out, but we help unpack unhelpful or sexist or misogynist or kind of rape jokes, that sort of thing, that we kind of challenge each other to do better with that stuff, that we make these conversations part of our everyday, that we have policies for the worst case scenarios, that we provide workshops with specialists to back up that change. So yeah, I think there's a million things that we can do, and we can also just get more comfortable sort of talking about the help that's out there, the help that we've found useful, all of those sorts of things, all normalise help seeking. And every time we talk about sexual violence, the thing I always say is we're creating a social norm that this is not a hidden experience. This is something that we talk about. So even just the act of putting it on the table helps.
Yeah, and that's what we're doing here at Fair Play. We're putting it on the table so that we can have constructive conversations and make this issue accessible. There was Eleanor Butterworth from New Zealand Rugby. Judy, some really interesting little nuggets there about making those conversations accessible.
Yeah, and when Elle's talking about not calling each other out, the way I like to think about it is calling each other in to having these conversations, right? We're calling people in to be allies and to be able to engage in these conversations, because we have to be able to talk about traditional gender roles and stereotypes and the harmful stuff, to talk about the good stuff we want and the positive role models we want to see.
And sports people are meant to be positive role models, right?
And a lot of the time they are. And when we look at this from a strengths-based position and say, okay, who can be the change and how can we create that change together, then we're looking at a way forward, looking at who is the solution and how can we be part of it.
We'll come back to you, Judy O'Brien, our lovely co-host for today. We'll be talking a little bit about education around consent shortly. But first, should it be down to organisations to organise themselves when it comes to preventing sexual violence through sport? Or should the government be legislating to ensure all sporting bodies have proper education and processes in place? MP, former Black Fern and regular Fair Play commentator Louisa Wall joins us. Kia ora, Louisa. Now, I know that you've got a scratchy voice because you've been at Te Matatini.
Kia ora, Zoe, I do, and my whānau team, Ngā Tūmanako won, and I screamed and shouted like I usually do when the All Blacks for the Black Ferns win. So that's my little caveat on my contribution this afternoon. But can I firstly start off by saying that actually we have to have these conversations. Issues to do with actually harassment, violence, abuse, and then when you put in the sexual element of today. I'm sure we all are aware that last week there was a court judgment where a man who had over 30 years groomed 17 boys aged between 9 and 15. He was a school rugby coach. And essentially the context of the provision of sport to our young boys he used as his playfield. And I think everybody now has to be a lot more vigilant, and we all have to put the issues of violence, sexism, abuse, and particularly the protection of our children and young people, and especially within the context for rugby, that over 85,000 under 13-year-olds, both boys and girls, are playing rugby across 26 unions.
There has been a lot of talk around sexual violence associated with sport of late, like you've mentioned. What's the government doing or is going to do regarding addressing this issue?
Yeah, and this is really timely because obviously in October last year we launched the Women and Girls in Sports and Active Recreation strategy. And the most poignant now inclusions in that strategy were about this being about inclusivity, but also that it needs to be about safe and appropriate and empowering environments for our women and girls to play sport. And then you couple that with the Sport Integrity Review. And again, this was in October last year, but that discussion paper is explicit because it says that everybody has the right to participate in a safe and fair way. The framework for the government providing a context for everybody in sport and recreation to have these conversations, they're not now we could have or should have. This is now a must-have situation. And so, as I said, I think it's timely because the government is working on this. And we now have to work with our national sporting organisations pretty much to say this thing is happening. We know it's happened in rugby. We know it's happened in football. There was a case last year in the Manawatu, 7 charges of grooming, and that involved a coach and girls in that instance. But I think, we don't need the evidence anymore to know that this is happening. We actually have to name it and tell people what it looks like. And we have to be really proactive in finding these people who are using these contexts to abuse our children.
Should major sporting bodies or any sporting bodies that have and rely on government funding, should have their funding cut if they do not impose these policies?
It's not about having funding cuts. Everybody needs to have policies and procedures. That's the bottom line. If anyone has children who are playing their sports, they need these. And actually, when we look at it legislatively, we're actually all responsible under the Care of Children Act 2014. And when that went through, we did extend it and we have made it compulsory for anyone working with children to go through a police vetting process. And I remember at that time a lot of people were worried because this was going to be an added expense. But what we needed to make sure was that the people who were working in those areas and working with our children, at minimum, had been police vetted. We've just had changes to legislation in terms of, sexual harassment policy. Every workplace now under the health and safety legislation must have policies and procedures. So, I do actually think we've been moving towards making this something that everybody has to do. I think the next step will be, auditing all the national sporting organisations, Sport New Zealand providing the template. Everybody at governance level needs to acknowledge that when they need to do something, and they should be, I think, expediting the policies and procedures if they don't have them. But that's where the leadership, I believe, of government does exist, because we should be assisting in the development of those policies and procedures.
Is there a timeline for all of those things?
Well, we know through the Sport Integrity Review that where they're at is assessing and analysing all the submissions that were made through that process. I don't know the actual timelines, and it'd be great if you contacted our Minister of Sport, but I think in including that aspect that everyone has the right to participate in a safe and fair way actually provides the imperative for an assessment of, so what does safe look like? Fair, obviously, from a woman and girls perspective, looks like women being involved right throughout the sport and the governance administration and obviously the participation of the sport. So I think what we now need to do is to actually anticipate that these behaviours are happening and be really proactive about making sure that we name it, shame it. You know, if it is happening, the whole of the sporting community needs to call it out. But the fact that we've had these court cases in the last couple of years highlight that sexual abuse of our children has taken place. And, you know, it's incumbent on all of us now to just not take things for granted, not take the goodwill of the volunteers for granted, but actually be really vigilant in the systems that we implement to make sure that, you know, we find those people who are actually in it for their own ends and that ultimately have been to abuse our kids.
MP, former Black Fern and regular Fair Play commentator Louisa Wall, losing her voice, has been to Te Matatini, which was the biennial kapahaka competition that's been here in Wellington this weekend. So, yes, some really some interesting conversations about putting policy in place. But it's not just about policy, it's about putting in place, I guess, personal
action plan. I mean, if we can be individual agents of change, we can support those collective movements. A lot of the time when we have policy in place, I'll talk about the bystander effect a little bit later, but there's also the voice bystander effect. And when we think that everybody else is familiar with policy, we're often a lot less likely to actually mention something wrong because we assume everybody knows what the policy is. I shouldn't have to speak up about it. So it's really important that we have those procedures in place to back the policy up so that if something does go wrong, people feel safe to actually speak up and they know that there is a procedure that is going to support them and make sure that something happens in response. Whether that just means connecting them with a support agency or just letting them be heard, or if it means something more. As long as that procedure is in place and people know that they're going to be safe, speaking up and reporting, that's what we need.
Speaking up and reporting. One of the things that I know that you do a lot of education around, Judy, is consent. So let's talk about consent in a bit of a nutshell so that, you know, we get a better understanding with it, because we can say no, but a no is no, but a yes is not necessarily a yes.
Sometimes a yes is not a yes. So, and that's a tricky conversation because, you know, it feels really powerful to say yes means yes and no means no. But in New Zealand law, there's 7 situations where yes does not always mean yes. So when we're talking about the definition of consent in New Zealand, we actually define consent by what it's not. So that means under 16, under the influence of drugs or alcohol, so stupefied or intoxicated, asleep or unconscious, forced, threatened or coerced, mistaken about the nature or quality of the act that you're actually consenting to. So if you say you consent to having sex with a condom and then the condom gets removed, you have not consented to that sexual activity. Your yes doesn't mean yes in action. Also, when we're talking about consent, we want a balance of power. And so all of these situations are situations where that balance of power isn't present, where that consent is not full, it's not free, it's not informed. The other thing that we can be mistaken about is who the person is. That's kind of the soap opera scenario where you think that you're with one twin and it's the evil twin or something like that. But
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
And consent can actually, I mean, it's not just for adults. I have a friend whose daughter is 15 months old, and she'll go hug Auntie Zoe, and she'll go, no. And I'm like, yeah, high five.
That's right. We don't have to hug everybody.
No.
And that goes for the workplace, that goes for on the street, that goes for kids as well. If we can start having those basic conversations about consent with our children, then they can start to understand when they shouldn't be giving hugs out to people, you know? Like, who are you giving that hug for? Are you giving that hug because you want to? Or is it for them? Where does the intention lie? So starting those conversations about consent as young as possible is really important, because another way we can look at the culture around violence and sexual violence is by looking at it as a pyramid. So along the base of that pyramid, we have attitudes, beliefs, ideas from society that contribute to a culture that allows these actions to happen. So if we target that base of the pyramid, we deconstruct that whole society that supports those individual incidences of physical assault and violence.
Judy O'Brien is our co-host today on Fair Play. Tell me about the bystander effect. in relation to our discussion.
Al briefly touched on the idea that when one person starts to speak up, other people speak up too. So the bystander effect is where basically the more people involved in a situation or witnessing a situation, the less likely one individual is to step forward. And that's because we've sort of created a social or psychological rule that says nothing is wrong here because nobody else is doing anything about it. The great thing about that is that when one person does intervene and choose to say this is a problem and it's my personal responsibility to do something about it, other people will start to engage and intervene as well. So we can flip that rule on its head by choosing to be that individual agent of change and saying, I'm not going to be a bystander, I'm going to step forward. And that doesn't mean being a hero. It means doing the smallest thing possible, just like checking in or noticing and saying, hey, does this look okay to you? And taking the opportunity to just get a little bit more information about a situation and prevent any potential harm from occurring.
If anyone wants any more information on anything that we've discussed today, you can find it on rnz.co.nz and also at wispsports.com. Thanks, Judy, for being part of that discussion along with Eleanor and Sarah and Louisa. It was quite a heavy one, so let's move on to a few quick hits. Halbergs, they are the New Zealand Premier Sports Awards. They were last week.
Yes.
Woo! Congratulations to a number of Kiwi women who kicked butt. Football goalkeeper Anna Lett, who won People's Choice after her heroics at the Under-17 Women's World Cup, especially in the penalty shootout against Japan, where she not only saved goals, but she scored the winner from the spot.
Superhero.
Amazing. Also, Lisa Carrington, she's already won 2 Sportswomen Awards of the Year, and she added a third this year. She's now unbeaten in the K1 200 competition over 7 years, retaining that title again in 2018. Also a superhero. And former world discus champion Beatrice Famawina was admitted to the New Zealand Sports Hall of Fame, which was incredible. Now, moving on, Rachel Maia, some of you may be familiar with her. She is a paraclimber and she's been on Fair Play in 2018. Now, she's actually undergone major surgery in the past week. Last Monday, she elected to have her leg amputated below the knee. I visited her in hospital on Wednesday and she's back home now on Whanganui. It was an incredibly emotional interview for both of us. Tears of laughter, sadness and hope. And I'll be following her journey before, during and after her surgery and as she prepares for the National Climbing Champs, which... Are you ready for this, Judy? Are in 8 weeks.
What?
Yes, she's incredible. She's determined to be ready. That interview will be on the April episode of Fair Play.
That is a mad level of resilience.
Oh, she is incredible. Her former name is Rachel Carter, so that's what some of our listeners will know her as. But yes, Rachel Maia. You can follow her on Instagram and her journey. And she made me touch her leg. Where she had it amputated, and so we had a bit of a moment there, and it was there's some incredibly moving stories that we'll be bringing you in April. And before we go, it wouldn't be a Fair Play without my favourite topic.
Potty parity.
The toilets at the Basin Reserve. The Wellington City Council and Basin Reserve Trust are overseeing the redevelopments of the loos, and when I inquired to the movement on them, I was informed by the council that they gave me an update about 3 weeks ago. Which is true, but this is a monthly podcast, so I'm kind of expecting another update. In last month's episode, we discovered some of the locks on the women's toilets were broken and brought it to the attention of the council and the Basin Reserve Trust. They fixed a latch on one of the women's toilets that was apparently too tight, but there's no update on fixing the locks that can't lock. We'll lock this in for next time. And that's it for this episode of Fair Play. Thank you to my guests, Sarah Leberman, Eleanor, Butterworth, Louisa Wall, and Judy O'Brien.
Kia ora, Zoe. Thank you for your continued commitment to positive cultural change.
Yes. Well, no, thank you for lending your voice and your thoughts and your encouragement to this conversation. You can find a feature article about today's interviews on the website.
Conversations from the world of women's sports. This is Wisp Sports Radio.
You can find all the episodes of Fair Play at rnz.co.nz or at wispsports.com, and you can join the conversation at wispsports, at rnz and at producer_Zoe. I'm Zoe George. Don't forget to play hard, but play fair.